In the southeastern coast of the Mediterranean, a new nation has begun from one large family that underwent a people movement that took them from being slaves in Egypt to possessors of the chosen land. What made them different from other nations around the time was that their identity, their move, and their new land were all specially guided by God. It all started with Joseph and his brothers. Joseph was Jacob, his father's favorite child, and Joseph has also had dreams prophesying that his family would bow down to him one day. And as expected, his brothers weren't really happy with those dreams, so they decided to throw Joseph into a well. His brothers saw some Egyptian merchants traveling around the area, so instead of letting him starve in the well, they decided to sell him as a slave to the merchants. Many years later, a famine came into the land of Canaan, so Joseph's family had nothing to eat. They decided to go to Egypt to bring home food. And when they got to Egypt, they saw that their brother Joseph was the Pharaoh's right-hand man. Instead of Joseph getting revenge on his brothers, he decided to let them move to Egypt so they would never have to deal with the famine again. Before their father, Jacob, who got his name Israel, passed, he blessed Joseph and his brothers so that they can become the 12 tribes of Israel, and they've continued to live in Egypt for generations. Long after Joseph and his brothers passed, the new Pharaoh has feared that the Israelites would take over Egypt, so he decided to make a law to drown all the infant boys in the Nile River. That got dark real fast. But there's one mother who decided to go against the law. She put her son in a basket on the Nile River so that he could safely float down the river out of harm's way and that she won't be executed. The baby was found by the Pharaoh's daughter. She took care of him and gave him the name Moses. Years later, when Moses was around 40 years old, he saw an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew slave. So he decided to kill the Egyptian. And of course, such actions will put him to death. So to escape death by the Pharaoh, he left Egypt and escaped to the land of Midian, where he married Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, and watched over his father-in-law's flock of sheep. 40 years later, Moses was normally tending to the sheep when God, in the form of a burning bush, called to him. God told him to go back to Egypt and to free the Israelites so that they can reside in the land God promised to their ancestors. Moses made excuses by saying he had a speech impediment, so God told him that his brother Aaron will do the speaking for him. Eventually, he and his brother went to Egypt to fulfill God's request. Moses did what God told him to do, but the Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. So God sent 10 plagues which convinced Pharaoh to finally release the Israelites. When Moses and the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh realized that there was no more workers to build houses and pyramids. Basically, Pharaoh screwed up. So Pharaoh and his men chased after the Israelites to get them back. God parted the Red Sea so that the Israelites can cross safely, and the Egyptians the Red Sea closed in and killed all of them, and this freed the Israelites from slavery from the Egyptians. But new problems began when the Israelites had nothing to eat or drink. God gave them manna, aka bread, and water to survive. But the Israelites turned petty and complained about how they were tired of eating the same stuff, and how it'd be better if they just stayed in Egypt. God told Moses to meet him on Mount Sinai, and Moses received the 10 commandments that Israel must abide by to be close to God. When Moses went back to the Israelite camp, he sees the Israelites worshiping a golden bull that his brother Aaron made while he was gone. Moses was so mad that he threw the 10 commandments to the ground, breaking it, pushed the golden bull to the fire, grounded the bull into powder, and forced the Israelites to drink it. Moses then had to go back to Mount Sinai to get the 10 commandments remade. And finally, Moses had God's law and gave it to the Israelites. Regardless of the 10 commandments, the Israelites were still disobedient the more they traveled. They finally reached the promised land, and Moses sent 12 spies to scope the land. 2 of the spies, whose names were Joshua and Caleb, said that the land was good and that they can take on the giants who were living there. However, the other 10 were scared of the giants living in the area, and the rest of the Israelites agreed with those 10. Even though they had God with them, they were too scared to fight the giants, and for their loss of faith, God didn't allow them to go to the promised land, but to wander in the wilderness for 40 years as punishment. After all the years passed and the adult generation died out while the new generation grew older, they were finally ready to go to the promised land. However, Moses wasn't allowed to enter by disobeying God's command by smashing a rock to give water to the Israelites, instead of telling it to give water as God commanded him to. Moses looked over the land from Mount Pisgah, While he was there, he assigned Joshua, one of the spies from earlier, to lead everyone into the promised land. On the mountain, Moses died at the age of 120, longer than most of us will live. God buried him in the land of Moab. Joshua led the Israelites to the promised land, but that didn't mean their problems didn't stop. They had to fend off against occupying areas such as the land of Jericho and deal with sin, lies, greed, and violence. But in the end, God still protected and watched over the Israelites, even in their disobedience, and to this day Israel still looks to God for their savior.